Thank you, Liz, and hello, everyone. It's a good morning for me coming from the Pacific Northwest. I'm out of Spokane, Washington, so for all of you on the East Coast, good afternoon. Um, as Liz was sharing, I'm Jake Newton, COO of the Center. My background started off in the U.S. military doing travel risk management for our war fighters. And then I came into the private sector in 2014. Have pretty well been here since with the center. I did a little bit of a time with a travel assistance company. I'm sure y'all are very familiar with those, and looking forward to walking through what personal security looks like for the traveler. And then I'm going to also relate this to you as program managers and those of you working within this larger spectrum on a day-to-day basis. But for a lot of this presentation, consider yourself as the traveler. And that's going to be kind of the approach that we take. And I want to begin with a little program called Slido. We're going to have some interaction with our time together. So what I would love for y'all to do, if you're on your computer, you can go to slido.com and type in that hash code, or you can scan the QR code on the right-hand side. But we're going to use Slido to interact with a scenario that I want to walk everybody through. So take a moment to do that. If I skip ahead while you're doing this, it'll still be available on future slides, but I'm just going to pause for a second so everybody can get into Slido. It's a really fun way to engage with the material. And so here after a moment, we'll keep moving forward. All right, so using Slido, little icebreaker to get us started, see how this actually works out. So if you haven't logged in, you can see the information on the left-hand side. But in the middle, you'll see the prompt. Right on your phone or on your computer, depending on how you signed in, you'll see the prompt. And the question is, what's your favorite place to vacation on the planet? North Carolina is the first answer I see. For me, it'd probably have to be Hawaii. I love Hawaii. I see Italy on the board. Thank you for Italy. Probably Italy. Love that. Italy has the best lasagna I've had, bar none. Absolutely phenomenal. Spain, incredible. The churros in Spain are just delectable. Lots of wonderful places on there. So as you can see, folks, there's different ways we'll interact with the material on here, but this is Slido. So it'll be a fun way that we'll actually use this time together to interact with the material that we're walking through. So keep your phones handy or keep your computers handy, because I'm going to have several prompts that are similar to this as we go through this scenario together. Of course, if you do have any questions or comments, you can launch those in the chat as well. But without further ado, let's get rolling. So my desire for you at the end of this time is that you have a basic understanding of how you as the traveler fit within the larger spectrum of travel risk management. That is my number one desire for you to come away with. What does it mean for you as the individual traveler to provide for your personal safety and security in the context of an organization, or even traveling on your own time? What does that look like from a personal security standpoint? That is what this entire time frame is going to be about. And we're going to do this through the means of the scenario that I mentioned. We're going to talk about what does it look like if we're going to go to GBTA Europe, November this year, over in Hamburg, and how do we take care of ourselves, as well as use the support resources available to us to either maximize our ROI, maximize our trip, maximize our well-being, but holistically ensure that we are prepared to deal with whatever comes our way. Oftentimes travel is smooth, it has typical disruptions, but we're going to look at a little bit of a different angle to whether we're traveling domestically or even internationally, to make sure that we're looking after ourselves the best we can. I'll conclude our time frame together from that programmatic standpoint, and it's just going to be a couple minutes to touch on what does the holistic process of travel risk management look like, and how does the training piece fall within this, kind of like we're doing today, and looking at the program from an organizational standpoint. the first critical thing, this is kind of the fundamental of this entire process. And one of the things we like to talk about at the center is how you, as a traveler, or even if you look at personal safety and security on the broad spectrum of things, in your own home, in the office, commuting to and from work locally, traveling overseas, traveling domestically, it begins with having ownership in your safety and security, ownership in your protection. It begins with you. Think about the process with the tragic incident that we just all saw a couple of months ago with the murder of the UHC CEO. Normally for executives or for people, in the higher echelons of an organization, they have their executive protection team. They have different threat management capabilities, different resources in place to look after their security. And those things are great. But when we don't have those things in place, or we don't have those capabilities, and emergencies occur, it's incumbent upon us, the individual, to decide what are we going to do about it to impact our own safety and security. And so in that incident, he didn't have his team with us and he was alone. He was walking down the street and he ended up getting harmed. He ended up getting shot and killed. And so basic concepts like this, we can't outsource our own awareness. We can't outsource the ability for somebody to always protect us. It starts with us. And that is the fundamental baseline understanding that I want to impart to everybody as part of this. We have to take that ownership. We are our own hero. So let's talk about this trip. We know we're going to GBTA Europe, and we get our flight booked, we get our hotel booked, travel accommodations perhaps. I would like to ask you, how do you prepare for your trip from a personal security perspective? What are things that you would generally do if you're going to Hamburg, Germany for this conference? What would be activities that you would do before you depart? Go ahead and throw your answers up on the Slido. Let's see what we get. And then we'll discuss some of these different options here. Review of the hotel and the surrounding area. I love that. We're going to elaborate on that. Enable the Life 360 app. That's a great thing. Life 360 is a really powerful tool. Keep an awareness of your family or friends, depending on who you're partnered with, communication capabilities, sharing itinerary, register in STEP, whoever said that, wonderful. STEP is the Safe Traveler Enrollment Program by the U.S. State Department. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Having that communication plan, sharing with family and coworkers. Y'all are experts. I love this. Checking the local timeshare company coverage. So if you're staying with the timeshare, what kind of benefits do they have? What kind of coverages do they work with you or have available for you as some of those support resources? That's great. Sharing your location at all times. Wonderful. And then having those check-in times from a communication standpoint. Use Share My Ride on Uber, another safety mechanism. So a lot of technological aspects to this. I love this. Let's talk about some of those considerations, but a lot of great input so far. So thinking about this holistically, there's a spectrum of things that we can do before we even depart the comfort of our own home. So here's a screenshot of the city. That tack in the middle of the screen is the event center. Now, there's a big difference in what you might do to prepare yourself, as you can imagine, for going to the grocery store in your local town to what you might do to prepare going to Hamburg, Germany for this conference. Maybe you've been to this city, maybe you haven't. Even that impacts things. So what do we do? What do we do to get ahead of this process? Well, it is that research and planning. And there's a lot of tools that we have at our disposal, i.e. one of those I like to use is Google right here that you can see on screen. And talking through some of the different considerations for what resources are available and what resources do I need to be mindful of? What is the the area looking like. So here's our event center. Maybe we're flying into this hotel or this airport over here. Maybe we're flying into this one over here, but there's a couple prominent airports. I like to look at main thoroughfares, main routes of travel, and try to the best I can, understand what's kind of the outer limits of where I'm going to be working. Let's say if you are driving, if you're not using a taxi, well, what are some of those boundaries that if you're not able to pay attention to your phone, you at least have some boundaries of, okay, I reasonably know where I might be located within the city. How about hospitals? Where is there hospitals, located close to your venue? Do we know where those might be? Here's one out here that actually shows the TAC. That's pretty far away. Is there something that's going to be a little bit closer? Bodies of water, how does that impact where we are? Can we use these things to get a sense of direction and have an orientation? Now, why might this be important? Well, one, if we're going to a place that's totally unfamiliar with us, this is helping us get an understanding and situational awareness of what we might be up against. Let's say a natural disaster might be coming through or some significant storm. The resources they might have available to respond to some of these emergencies, what is available and what's not available. Having that little bit of extra preparedness of what you're up against, one, it can really help reduce a lot of stress. So you just have an indication of what you're going to be up against. But secondly, if something does happen, it reduces that amount of time when time might be of the essence for you to be able to make decisions and identify what you're working with. So if you have to work through a complicated city structure, is it laid out in a grid pattern? Is it laid out in kind of a spider web? What's the orientation of things so that you can maneuver easily? You might be able to generally find your direction, what's north, south, east, and west. So if you're getting turned around, if there's a prominent structure, I always like to use the example of Washington, D.C. The National Mall is a huge prominent feature right in the middle of the district. So if you can see that, you're able to have a reasonable understanding of where you're at within the city. Applying these principles to other locations is just going to make your trip a little bit more easy. Now, again, it's a spectrum here. You're not going to do this for necessarily every single trip. That's time intensive. Time is money. Time is very precious. We might not have to do this every time. But what I encourage you to do is if you're going to a new area, sit down, take the time, figure out where you're going to be going, do that research and get ahead of the schedule. How does this relate from a personal security standpoint? I'm going to get my clicker back here. How does this relate from a personal security standpoint? Somebody mentioned registering with STEP, the Safe Traveler Enrollment Program. Now, the Safe Traveler Enrollment Program is the State Department's capability for knowing that you are traveling overseas, and it provides them with a few different benefits to you as the traveler. They know you're going to be there. If something happens to you, they can provide you some information. They can provide you some resources. Let's say if in the event you were maybe detained, you sign off on a privacy statement, they're able to share with your family or whoever you designate that you're actually over there and that you're in the hands of law enforcement. Whatever the issue might be, having the State Department know that you are in a certain country that is not the United States gives the U.S. government to have added resources should an emergency happen. Now, while it doesn't happen very often, every once in a great while, even the U.S. government will step in and help evacuate or help provide assistance in some of these different emergencies that have occurred around the world. But at a minimum, they're a great informational resource. And in addition to that, the other thing that they can provide, if you go to the travel.state.gov, it's a wonderful website to identify all of the different things you're going to be up against from a crime standpoint, local laws, transportation, travel insurance considerations, female safety considerations, visa requirements, all kinds of different travel safety tips. It's a great website to get country specific, and even in some spots, it breaks down to the regional specificity as well. A couple of last tips, and then we'll move on. From a last logistical standpoint, got a question here. Do you know if nationals include permanent residents? That's a good question. I think so, but I'd have to confirm. If somebody else in the audience knows that question, feel free to chime in. Um, from a quality of life standpoint, also look at some of the logistical things. We all rely on our cell phones. Don't take it for granted that your cell phone is going to be user friendly the entire time throughout your trip. And here's an example of what I mean. What if your battery dies? Then what are you going to do? Do you have any backups of how you're going to get information throughout your trip? Maybe charge that thing back up, but this is why it's good to have in our noggins, or maybe even on paper, some of those backup things that are crucial to us: phone numbers, addresses that you're going to go, whatever it might be. Because sometimes, even if it's just a language barrier, having the ability to show that address can make things a little bit easier. So having your cell phone prepared, maybe if you have a portable battery, downloading your maps on your phone. So if you lose internet access in a big metropolitan area, you're still able to navigate easily. Identifying what wall plugs you're going to need. What's the cash situation there? Where's our stations for money exchange? All of those different things. But all of these things in the beginning, if you've not done this before, it's going to feel like work. So here's my recommendation. Create a checklist. Create a checklist for all of these different things. State Department can help you with this. There's a lot of wonderful resource out there on the interwebs, but create a checklist and then it'll become habit, and it will take a little bit less time as you get ingrained with these different things. We always want to be ahead of the game when it is related to safety and security considerations. So we've made it. We've made it into town. We've made it into Hamburg. We're going through customs. We're on our way to taking care of our trip to go experience the conference. So let's talk a little bit about this. What are the things, back into Slido, as a traveler that makes you feel the least safe while traveling? Let's talk about some of these considerations. What would you say is the thing that causes you the most concern? Being by yourself, taxis, rideshare, public transit. If I had to guess, it was probably the public aspect of the transit consideration. Being out at night, also a big piece. Being approached or followed by a stranger, especially one with as ugly of a mug as I have, I can only imagine. Being in a foreign environment, yeah, sometimes there's just that little bit of anxiety that we can feel from being in a new place. I actually remember when I was in France several years ago, I do not speak French. And one of the things that I was experiencing over there is a lot of the people I happened to be speaking to did not speak English. And sometimes that can be intimidating, and having that language barrier and the difference in culture. There's a lot of different considerations that can, kind of cause that difference. So we're going to talk about what that looks like. Being out at night, being by yourself. But so notice a lot of these different things on the screen. Almost all of these are within your control. So that's just kind of one thing to think about. A second aspect of this is those things that are not within your control. There's things that we can do about it to mitigate either the stress, mitigate the anxiety, mitigate the potential for something happening to us. So let's continue the scenario here. We're on our way to the restaurant. It's time to get some dinner. We dropped our stuff off at the hotel. It's time to go get a bite. And then this happens. All right, so take notice of a couple of those things, either in the chat or Slido. What'd you notice? What were some things that stuck out to you about what just happened? And how might we have avoided this from happening to us? What are some things that you noticed? Not paying attention, staying off the phone. It's kind of like, this is the blanket thing. When we start talking about the concept of situational awareness, it's like, what is situational awareness? Staying off your phone, right? So paying better attention, that's a critical aspect of this. Okay, what are some other things we noticed? We're not being aware of our surroundings. We're not recognizing some of those different things that are coming up. I mean, a dirt bike on a sidewalk would probably be pretty easy to notice if we're looking for it or if we're listening for it. So that's what we call a clue. Why is a dirt bike coming down a sidewalk? Anything else that we notice? One other thing that I want to bring everybody's attention to is, did you notice that after they took his watch, he ran after them? He tried to get his watch back. Probably not the best protocol in that kind of a circumstance, especially when it's 1 against 3. We've got these guys coming in, trying to take his watch and make a fast getaway, and then he pursues them. Your watch is not worth your life. In those kinds of circumstances, let's just worry about the watch later, and let's worry about our individual life before we worry about those things. So this is where that preparedness mentality, thinking about some of these things ahead of time, when we have these circumstances happen in real life, our stress levels go through the roof. We have a stress response to these kinds of circumstances. And what happens is we go into, in some cases, we freeze, we go into autopilot, or our body responds in a manner based upon what's happened similar to this before. So when we start getting ahead of these different situations, it allows us to have some sort of mental framework to be able to identify how we would respond. So we can talk about what that looks like more, but all of this begins with this concept of situational awareness. You've probably all heard of this concept, but what does it mean to you? How do you apply situational awareness in your day-to-day? What does it look like in practice for you? Another one for the Slido here, my friends. Research where you're going. Beautiful. Situational awareness starts from the comfort of our own home. We know we have a trip. We're going to San Francisco. We're going to New York City. We're going to Des Moines, Iowa. What are the things that we need to be mindful of before we even go on these trips? That helps give us that understanding of what we might be up against. So one of the ways I like to do this before I travel, particularly if I'm going to a new area, is I'll check the local news. What's the pulse of the area? That's a really great way that you can set yourself up for success, particularly here in the United States. When it's actually kind of difficult sometimes to get a feel because we don't have necessarily intelligence down to the local level in a very readily, excuse me, in a very readily accessible manner. So you check that local news. Sometimes you can even call local law enforcement. Call them up. They have an information office. Oftentimes you can call them, see what they have to say. Those are kinds of things that you can do for the domestic side. If you're going overseas, State Department is a wonderful aspect of this. Registering into the STEP program, you'll get those warnings to be able to recognize what this looks like. Okay, so we're going to talk more about this, but it absolutely begins before you even leave the comfort of your own home. I've got a couple more coming up here. Avoiding crowds. That is also a very astute thing to do, because when we get in the midst of a crowd, if you think about the incident that happened in Korea, I want to say it was a couple years ago now for the Halloween celebration, big crowd, it ended up turning into I forget what the term was, but it was overpopulated and people ended up getting killed because they were crushed in the midst of the crowd. So there's a lot of different things that we want to ensure as we're going through this process. Okay, researching how people dress. How can we blend in with that local population? Also a fantastic thing to do. People are oftentimes going to recognize that we're a foreigner anyway. It's not necessarily something that they won't recognize, but if we're making ourselves stick out more, if we're I like to call it the long neck turkey at Thanksgiving. Which one is the one that gets taken for the dinner table at Thanksgiving? It's the one with the longest neck that stands out. So how are we allowing ourselves to blend in with that environment as best we can? What do they wear? What do they don't wear? What are the trends? Those cultural aspects, and even the State Department website, or even if you're traveling on behalf of your organization, your security team, your intel team, or whoever you have available, consult with them. If you have travel insurance or if you have a travel assistance provider, Oftentimes you can call them and they can give you a briefing or intelligence on the area that you're going to get a lot of this information. There's resources out there to do the heavy lifting for you. The big thing that you got to do is just take that ownership and pursuing that information. When you're traveling to an environment, and this is applicable for anywhere that you go, situational awareness is this. We've talked about that awareness. That is absolutely situational awareness. But what does that look like in practice? Okay. We like to talk about this from the context of establish normal for your environment. How do people behave? What is the local culture? Understanding that other cultures don't behave the same way that we do. Normal for other places is not normal for us. This is even the same for Florida. Normal is not the same for Louisiana normal. So taking that time to establish a basis of normal so that we can recognize those abnormalities and then respond accordingly based upon what we're seeing. There's a lot of times when emergencies occur or things happen, there's warning signs, whether it's noise, whether it's something we see, whether it's something that we feel, particularly feel in our intuition, that unconscious level of communication inside of our body telling us something is not right here, and listening to that. Oftentimes we can just sense these things before they even happen, or if they're about to happen, really paying attention to what our body is telling us. Sometimes that's one of the best ways we can provide for our intuition or provide for our personal security. My wife has a really strong intuition, and there's been times where we've gone into shopping malls or wherever we're out and about in the public, and she'll be like, you know what? Something just feels off about this place. Can we go somewhere else for dinner or go whatever it is? And so we listen to those things because sometimes our tendency is to dismiss it, particularly when we're in the midst of other people. We don't want other people to feel uncomfortable. We don't want to be awkward about a situation. But it's important to listen to that and communicate it if we're with other people. See if they sense the same thing, and identifying, okay, how do we need to take care of the situation? Believe what you see in here. That's what it comes down to. So a couple other layers of this. We've talked about getting ahead of things, but then we're also looking at from a here and now standpoint, where have I been? How was that? Where am I currently residing? Where am I currently standing? What is the situation around me? What's going on? And then where am I going? And having all of these different things kind of mapped out in our brains to understand the larger context of what you're dealing with. Ultimately, it comes down to taking the time to recognize what's going on and acting upon those observations and continually responding accordingly. Even situational awareness is a spectrum. You're not going to be overly vigilant in your house because you're going to know with relative ease if something is out of place in your home. You're going to know with sounds just based upon living there, having that normality well established. If there's an awkward sound, you're going to be like, wait a minute, what was that? And then you find out it was just a tree outside because of a storm. It's a heavy, windy storm. But you recognize those things and it makes your senses perk up. That can be harder to do in a brand new environment. So it's important that when you're in increasingly new environments to uptick your level of observation and studying of the areas around you. So hopefully that makes sense. And hopefully that's kind of a practical way to do some of these different things. When you become situationally aware, you do some of these different things, it's offering you the ability to become a hard target. Does anybody know? Throw it in the chat. I'm curious if you know. When criminals try to find their victims, what are they looking for? Does anybody know what a criminal might be looking for before they try to rob somebody or try to harm somebody? Anybody know what they're looking for? So oftentimes what they're looking for is, yes, distraction, easy targets. They've actually done a study on this years ago. It's fascinating. They showed a bunch of CCTV footage, security camera footage to convicted criminals. And they said, what of these people that you see walking through these cameras would you target for potential crime? And there was commonalities all the way across the board in each one that they would identify. Those that have a slow, non-purposeful or discombobulated gait to their walk, or overly small gait to their walk, where they're kind of walking without that confidence or that feeling unsure of themselves. So becoming a hard target, it's being situationally aware. It's walking with purpose. I like to use the analogy of walk like a flight attendant. It's like if you're in an airport and you get in front of a flight attendant, you're going to end up on the ground really fast because they stop for no one. But having your shoulders back, your chin up, you're walking like you own the place. And oftentimes, those kinds of behaviors create even just a little bit of defensibility for yourself and help you become a hard target. A couple other things. Are we observing the behaviors around us? Suspicious behaviors. Is somebody lingering or loitering? Is somebody giving you undue attention? Is somebody kind of pacing around an area? Out here in Spokane, one of the things that we have a lot of times in parking lots is people scoping cars to see what doors are unlocked and where can they take stuff from vehicles. And there's a pattern that you'll see to these individuals every single time. They kind of loiter, they'll walk past a car and they'll just kind of glean into a window. There's these behaviors that we can recognize that are abnormal to these different situations. Is somebody sweaty in a place that they shouldn't be? So there's some of these different things, but we're taking that precaution in our routes. Are we walking the same way, the same time every single day and becoming predictable? Maybe in a very new environment, we want to vary those routes. Are we communicating our plans publicly? We want to avoid that. Don't tell people what room you're staying in. Don't tell people what hotel you're staying at. Don't tell people information that is not appropriate to be out in the public. You want to keep that to yourself and private. And of course, be mindful wherever you go of what your emergency response options are. It's not about being fearful. It's about being mindful and having that layered approach to this so that you can be ready for whatever environment you're in. If there's emergency exits, if you're in a town, where would you go for safety? Where are those hospitals? Where are the law enforcement agencies in the local area? Having that mindfulness of where these different considerations are. There's so much to this, folks, and I'm only kind of scratching the very surface with a lot of these considerations, but let's get back into the scenario. We get back to the hotel. We've had a long day. We went to the restaurant. We did end up making it to dinner, and it was amazing. It was your favorite dish. It was beautiful. But now we're back at the hotel, and we are ready for a drink. So we're going to have a nightcap. We decide to have a drink before calling it a night. You order a drink, but you have to depart for a moment to use the restroom. About 7 minutes has passed. When you return, your drink is sitting there waiting for you. What would you do? What are your thoughts? Is there anything that would come to mind for you at the hotel? Is there anything that you would do based upon this? Another one for the Slido. Get a fresh drink. Why would we get a fresh drink? Why might that be the case? Definitely don't want to leave our drink unattended. I think we can probably all, in our imagination, recognize why this is the case. Now, maybe you get an entirely new drink, maybe you don't, but at the very minimum, inspect that thing. Is there a foreign object in that drink? Is there somebody sitting next to you as you approach your seat that was not there before? Is somebody watching you as you go to sit back at the bar? Did you have any odd encounters beforehand? Again, this is that contextual stuff that if we're paying attention to it, does it give us an insight into what's going on? Do you have a friend there? Is somebody with you that can guard your drink when you get your drink before you head to the restroom and come back? So it's contextual to all of these different things. But again, it's just that little bit of mindfulness on the front side of this before we get back to these things. And these can be the big difference makers in something terrible happening to us versus something happening to us or not at all. And these little tweaks, oftentimes when we see incidents happen, more often than not, there's these warning signs, there's these indicators that something is happening, or we don't listen to the things that our body is telling us, and we move forward with the decision, and then we get harmed in some sort of capacity. And so just these little bit of micro things. It's a 2% shift for a 358%, 300 degree rather, impact on your personal safety and security. So finally, we get up to our room, we enjoy our drink for the night. Tomorrow is the day for the conference. It's time to go have some fun. Here we go, GBTA Europe, and we're sitting in our first presentation, and then this happens. Oh, let me get my... Everybody probably can't hear that, huh? Let me share sound. Sorry about this, y'all. Allow me to share sound. Okay, I'm going to start this over.
No. Sexually assault my wife 7 years ago. So you have now you know what you did. You tell your wife and you touch my wife 7 years ago in New York. Don't be an asshole. If this is for all that makes you like to sexual assault women, next is you. Be a man. You know I need. You have three beautiful and talented women right here working with you. And 7 years ago, you touched my wife in New York. I thought this is in Brazil, I kill you. You think this is America? Because this is in Brazil, I kill you.
Security.
You get security and police, I don't give a now you're 7 years I'm waiting for this. 7 years I wait. My wife is suffering because you predator. And you know what you did. Don't you know what you did. You touched my wife. It's the best day of her life. When she you lucky that I don't kill you. Last one more time. Last one more time. Last one more time. Stop. Please. This is for you two. This is for you girls. Because this like to touch women. Do you know what he said? He said, no I can't, and grab my wife. You now you don't have to manage yourself. You nothing. You know half of man.
Not the place, not the time.
All right, so let's talk about this a little bit. We're at GBT Europe and we experience this incident. How would we respond? What would you do in this kind of circumstance? What are some things if you even notice some different things that were things that you did notice of the people in the room? What would you do if this happened? Leave, absolutely. Call security immediately. Now there's kind of a couple layers of this that we'll talk about. We did see somebody say, hey, is there security around? So some folks definitely saw that. Call 911 if we're in the US. But here's kind of a thing, right? Do we know overseas what the local emergency management or local emergency response number might be for the local law enforcement? Do we have that stashed away somewhere? That goes back to that communications plan, having the local law enforcement number, having the local embassy number for the US Embassy, having some of these things stashed away so that we can have them prepared beforehand. But of course we don't want to stay around this situation. Of course we don't want to leave ourselves exposed to these kinds of things. Now, is this an extreme incident? Not necessarily. However, this is one of those things that we don't necessarily want to stay around, because who knows how that might have escalated. Did anybody pick up on the threat? Did anybody pick up on it throughout the scenario when he heard the laughing or whatever it was, and he said, hey, listen, if this wasn't Brazil, I would kill you right now. I think he said Brazil. So there's this continued escalating for this entire process. So absolutely, when we see these kinds of things, avoid the area. Crowds, if we start to see some sort of unrest, if we have these sorts of acts of aggression, even if it's on the street, a couple people, go the other way. Don't allow yourself to get entangled in these kinds of things. Because you could see the people, it's not an uncommon response for people to sit there, because sometimes what happens is we just don't know what the right response is. We've not experienced something like that before. And so going back to that preparedness mentality, that forethought in this process, recognizing, okay, this could impact me, and then having a framework of, I'm going to get away from this area. Do you leave the entire venue? That's a decision you have to make. But at a minimum, get out of that area. We report this information to the local authorities, to maybe your own security leadership. This is something that if you're traveling on behalf of your company or your organization, we want to make sure they're aware of these kinds of things, especially if there's an investigation that ends up occurring and you're a witness, whatever this is. We want to make sure that our leadership is aware of these different things going on. And then, of course, another piece of this is venue staff and security. Are they even aware of this? We don't want to assume that somebody else has reported this. We want to be an upstander in this process to help de-escalate or help make sure these things get responded to accordingly. So getting that information reported, avoiding that area is one example. But there's a whole myriad of kinds of things that we could come up against across the world. It could be potential violence. One of the biggest ways people are harmed or die overseas is transportation accidents. That's one of the number one ways that people die. So there's mitigating factors for that entirely within our control. But this is before we go on a trip. What are those risk factors we're up against? It's going to vary depending on where we go. If we go to high risk environments, well, maybe we want to have some skills based upon the issues that make that environment high risk should it occur to us. Now, a lot of these things are pretty unlikely in happening, but how much better would you feel? How much more confident would you feel if you get some practice or you get training before you experience these things? And then if it actually does happen, you'll be able to get through it. You'll be able to respond. You'll be able to recover. So many of these things, when we would teach people in the Air Force, when we teach people in the private sector, this is all about experiencing these things in a safe environment, experiencing and preparing your brain to experience this kind of stress beforehand. And then what that does is gives you that confidence. It builds that, it's kind of like an immunization. It builds that immunity to these kinds of things if they were to happen in real life. We used to teach people how to survive being a prisoner of war. We used to teach people, we still do actually with the center, but how to survive a hostage situation or an act of violence or robbery. There's protocols and things that you can do to get through each of these kinds of scenarios. But if you've not thought about it before, it gives you that you're behind the power curve. You want to be able to give yourself as many decision-making tools that you can have should you actually experience an emergency. And that's what all of this is about. That's it with this entire thing. It's a preparedness mindset. It's getting ahead of it and building some of that capacity. So bringing this in for a landing, my friends, I want to share just a couple aspects of what does this look like holistically? How can we prepare, whether it's for ourselves or from an organizational standpoint? This is the process for training the traveler. Every traveler in an organization should have a baseline awareness level training. Now, this is based upon a couple things, the geographic risk, as well as the risk related to the individual person. So let's say somebody is traveling and you have some information that you don't want getting out to the public, or you have some intellectual property knowledge that maybe if you're traveling to a country, they might desire that information. That increases your risk as an individual. So at a baseline, everybody, we want to have an awareness level of training. As you go up in risk, you want to have some geographic specific training. I just did, as an example, India. I did a travel briefing for a group of executives that were going over to India. It was their first time into the country. There's not a whole lot across India that you have to have concern about, but it is one of those environments that can have some variables if you're not ready. So I gave them a briefing about specifically what they'd be up against, and did that in a relatively short amount of time, but it's tailored to the culture, tailored to the actual environment they'd be in, rather than kind of general principles globally. One of the things that we talked about there is in India, cows are sacred. That's a huge cultural item there that if you're not familiar with, well, you could get yourself in hot water if you're mistreating leather or mistreating some of the livestock over there. So there's some of those things that you don't necessarily think about, that it just takes a little bit of added awareness. And then, of course, as you go up to the next level, high risk travel is that top level. We're going into extreme or high risk environments. That's where we want to get into what we call stress inoculation training. You need to practice the actual risks that you might experience. So let's say it is a hostage situation that is really extreme risk in this environment, and you're going to that location. Practice hostage survival. Get some training on how to actually navigate those different things. If it's a natural disaster, do a basic exercise of how you would respond to those things. Get some training on those different capabilities and actually do some repetitions before it might happen in a real life circumstance. Here's just a basic list of the minimum topics you'd want to have in your training. This is based upon standards. The main standard for travel, hopefully you've all heard about it now, is ISO 31030, 31030. And it's a travel risk management international standard, a consensus-based standard that had over, I want to say 70 countries agree to the contents. And this is some of what that says that we want to have as a baseline standard for those areas that we're going to. And this is also benchmarked to some other organizations like OSAC, which is a State Department public-private partnership here in the US. But this is that minimum standard you want to give everybody, recognizing that we look at those cultural issues, looking at local crime, understanding local laws. For example, you go to Singapore, you cannot bring gum into the country. Chewing gum, who would have thought, right? Those are some important things to be mindful of. Travel-specific technology. Some countries, maybe with your job, you have to bring a satellite phone. Some countries, that is absolutely illegal. But also being trained on how to use those technologies if you're going around the world, so that if you have to use it, it's not your first time trying to figure these things out. So a nice little list there. Looking at this from the holistic perspective, this is what we have as the travel risk management framework. So it starts with preparation. Couldn't be overemphasized. Plans, policies, procedures, travel risk policy, traveler emergency action plans, a plan to implement the program, having a multidisciplinary cross-functional team to do this process, whether it's the travel manager plus security, plus somebody in benefits, plus whoever is taking care of insurance. We want to have that team integrated so that they're not in silos. So when these things happen, we're all working on the same page. And especially if it's a crisis, having that crisis management team be actively engaged as well as that's appropriate. Making sure everybody in that process has the competencies for what's expected of them. And then, of course, there's that equipment and technology piece as well. It's for all of these different stakeholders having their adequate awareness for the entire process, planning for individual trips based upon the geographic risk, the political risk, the personnel risk, from the organizational level, the individual level, and the governmental level. So what that means is we do have the governmental considerations of, if we're traveling overseas, there's the political risk, probably not the best time to be traveling to Russia or Ukraine as an example. However, there's also support that our government can provide. Are we aware of that? Do we know what those resources are? And are we leveraging those for our benefit? So we're planning for all of those things as it relates to travel in general, and then for trips specifically as they're occurring throughout the year. And then execution is If something happens, do people know how to report, who to report to, when to report? Can we locate that traveler and support them? Maybe their trip got canceled. Maybe they get sick. How are we supporting them? Maybe that's the travel assistance. Maybe the traveler can do things on their own. Do we recover their trip? Are they on their way, or do we have to bring them home? And then, of course, if something happens, we want to get that information. We want to make sure that they are taken care of from a mental and physical standpoint. We capture the information of what happened so we can identify lessons learned, adapt this information, assess what we need to do better, identify requirements moving forward, and mitigate all of that information back into the program. It's a continual cycle, and it's a system. Travel risk management is a holistic process, but the traveler is right in the middle of all of this. If there's something that is so critical to this process, it's having a prepared traveler. So with that, my friends, bringing this in for a landing, be centered in your security. Take ownership in it. Plan, plan, plan. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Have a process to keep in touch with people on a regular basis. And remember, be mindful, not fearful. None of this has to create anxiety in you. It's all about just being prepared. You put your seatbelt on in your car every time you drive. It's the same mentality that we apply to travel. So with that, I'll advance one more slide. And first of all, I just want to say thank you. But if you have any questions, happy to answer those for the last few minutes we have together.